Boy King Tutankhamun lay still in his burial chamber, his death mask gleaming with the last defiant flash of Egypt's fading glory. While beyond the tomb's sealed entrance, the shadows of collapse crept across the Nile like a plague of darkness. But this was not where the story began. To understand how the mightiest civilization of the ancient world could crumble into dust, we must travel back through the corridors of time, past the whispers of dying gods and the screams of conquest, to witness how empire was born from the mud of the Nile, and the dreams of men who believed themselves divine. The Egyptian empire did not emerge from nothing. It rose like a phoenix from the ashes of chaos, forged in the crucible of the first intermediate period, when the land of the pharaohs had splintered into warring kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy while the people starved, and the gods seemed to turn their faces away. The Nile, that great lifeline of Egypt, ran red with blood, instead of the fertile silt that had sustained generations. In those dark centuries between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egypt had learned the bitter taste of powerlessness. Provincial governors had become petty kings, their armies clashing in the shadow of crumbling pyramids while famine stalked the land. Children were sold into slavery to buy bread, and mothers threw themselves into the Nile rather than watch their babies starve. The cosmic order that had sustained Egypt for a millennium had shattered like pottery dropped on stone. It was from this nightmare that the Middle Kingdom emerged. But true empire, that intoxicating dream of dominion over foreign lands, would not come until the new kingdom burst forth like a supernova in the 16th century BC. The catalyst was humiliation, the deepest wound a proud people could endure: foreign rule. The Hyksos, those enigmatic invaders from the east, had swept down from Canaan with their horse-drawn chariots and composite bows, technologies that made the traditional Egyptian army seem as obsolete as stone axes against bronze swords. For over a century, these foreign kings ruled the Delta, while native Egyptian pharaohs cowered in Thebes, reduced to vassals in their own sacred land. The psychological scars ran deeper than any physical conquest. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, the center of the world in the minds of its people, had been revealed as vulnerable, mortal, conquerable. The gods themselves seemed to have abandoned their chosen people. The Hyksos period was more than political subjugation. It was an existential crisis that shattered Egyptian assumptions about their place in the cosmic order. Temple inscriptions from this period speak of cities in flames, of sacred statues smashed by foreign hammers, of priests fleeing into the desert with whatever sacred objects they could carry. The invaders did not merely conquer. They desecrated, treating Egypt's most holy sites with contempt that cut deeper than any sword. But from this crucible of shame and rage, a new Egypt was born. Kamose and his brother Amos, princes of Thebes, began the war of liberation that would transform their homeland from a collection of mud-brick towns along the Nile into an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates. The expulsion of the Hyksos was more than military victory. It was a resurrection, a rebirth in fire and blood that would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come. Amos, founder of the 18th dynasty, did not merely drive out the invaders. He pursued them beyond Egypt's traditional borders, his armies thundering across the Sinai into Canaan itself. The lesson of vulnerability had been learned too well to ignore. Egypt could never again afford to wait passively for threats to materialize. The best defense was conquest, and conquest became the obsession of the new kingdom pharaohs. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and brutality. Egypt's traditional army of peasant levies and Nubian archers was revolutionized with Hyksos military technology. Bronze weapons replaced copper, horse-drawn chariots gave Egyptian forces unprecedented mobility, and a professional officer class emerged to replace the old feudal levies. Most importantly, the pharaohs embraced a new ideology of aggressive expansion that would have horrified their pyramid-building ancestors: Under Thutmose I, Egyptian armies crossed the Euphrates for the first time, setting up a victory stela on the banks of that distant river as if planting a flag on the moon. The psychological impact was immense. Egypt had reached the edge of the known world, had touched the realm of the gods themselves. The pharaoh's courtiers could barely comprehend the scale of their master's achievements, and foreign ambassadors prostrated themselves before the throne in genuine awe. The records of these early conquests reveal a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the will of potential rebels before they could organize resistance. Entire populations were uprooted and relocated, their cities burned, and their fields salted to prevent recovery. The pharaoh's scribes recorded these atrocities with bureaucratic precision, counting severed heads and cataloguing plunder. With the same attention to detail they brought to tax collection. But it was under Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, that the empire reached its first zenith of power and terror. For 22 years, this pharaoh led campaign after campaign into Asia, his armies becoming a machine of conquest that crushed resistance with methodical brutality. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC was more than a military victory. It was a declaration that Egypt had evolved beyond the insular kingdom of the pyramids into something unprecedented, a superpower. The siege of Megiddo lasted 7 months, and when the city finally fell, Thutmose III's revenge was absolute. The surviving defenders were flayed alive, and their skins nailed to the city gates as a warning to future rebels. Children were taken as slaves, women distributed among the pharaoh's soldiers, and the city's treasures loaded onto trains of pack animals for the journey back to Thebes. This was not mere warfare, but systematic dehumanization, the reduction of entire peoples to resources to be exploited. The records of Thutmose III's campaigns read like a catalogue of horrors. Cities burned, populations enslaved, entire peoples relocated to prevent future rebellion. At Kadesh, Egyptian soldiers stacked the severed hands of enemy dead in gleaming pyramids, while scribes carefully counted the grisly trophies. The pharaoh himself recorded with clinical precision the tons of gold, silver, and copper stripped from conquered territories. The thousands of prisoners marched in chains toward the Nile, the horses and chariots that would strengthen Egypt's military machine. Yet beneath this veneer of conquest lay a more complex reality. Egypt's empire was built not just on military might, but on economic exploitation that dwarfed anything seen in the ancient world. The tribute flowing into Egypt from conquered territories was staggering in its scope and systematic in its extraction. Gold from Nubian mines, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Punt, silver from Anatolia. Every conquered territory was assessed not for its strategic value, but for its economic potential. The Nubian territories were perhaps the most crucial to Egypt's imperial economy. Known for rich deposits of gold, Nubia was also the gateway through which luxury products like incense, ivory, and ebony traveled from their source in sub-Saharan Africa to the civilizations of Egypt and the Mediterranean. The systematic exploitation of Nubian gold mines created unprecedented wealth that funded Egypt's military expansion and monumental building projects for centuries. The working conditions in these mines were horrific beyond imagination. The primitive working conditions for the slaves are recorded by Diodorus Siculus. Prisoners of war, criminals, and political dissidents were marched south in chains to die in tunnels carved from living rock. The mortality rate was so high that fresh shipments of slaves arrived monthly to replace those who had perished in the darkness below ground. The wealth that flowed into Egypt from these conquests was staggering. Gold from Nubian mines, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from Punt, tribute from a dozen vassal kingdoms. The Nile Valley became a vast treasure house that funded ever more ambitious building projects and military campaigns. The Temple of Karnak swelled with new additions as each pharaoh sought to outdo his predecessors in magnificence. Hieroglyphic inscriptions boasted of mountains of gold and silver, of tribute that filled the pharaoh's storehouse to overflowing. But perhaps the most remarkable pharaoh of this golden age was a woman who dared to claim the throne itself. Hatshepsut ruled for 22 years, transforming Egypt through trade rather than conquest. Her expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt returned with exotic animals, aromatic trees, and precious goods that filled her subjects with wonder. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands as a testament to her vision, its terraced gardens and soaring colonnades speaking of a ruler who understood that true power could be built on more than military might alone. Hatshepsut's reign represented a brief interlude of relative peace in Egypt's imperial expansion, but even she could not escape the logic of empire entirely. Her trading expeditions to Punt were backed by military force, and her construction projects were funded by tribute extracted from subject peoples. The difference was one of emphasis rather than fundamental philosophy. She preferred to build wealth through commerce while maintaining the threat of military intervention. Yet even Hatshepsut could not escape the patriarchal assumptions of Egyptian kingship. Her successor, Thutmose III, systematically defaced her monuments and erased her name from official records, not from personal hatred, but from the imperial necessity of maintaining the fiction of unbroken male succession. Empire demands conformity to its myths, and those who challenge its fundamental assumptions, even successfully, become dangerous memories that must be eliminated. The defacement of Hatshepsut's monuments was carried out with surgical precision. Her image was chiseled from temple walls. Her cartouches were replaced with those of male predecessors, and her accomplishments were credited to the pharaohs who came before and after her. This systematic erasure reveals the deep insecurity that lay beneath Egyptian imperial confidence. The fear that any deviation from established norms might undermine the entire structure of divine kingship. The apex of Egyptian imperial power came with Amenhotep III, the Sun King who ruled when Egypt's dominance was so complete that warfare became almost unnecessary. Foreign kings sent their daughters to his harem as gestures of submission, and his palaces glittered with tribute from across the known world. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from this period, reveal a world where Egypt was the undisputed superpower, its pharaoh addressed by other rulers as Great King and Brother, only when they themselves ruled significant territories. The Amarna letters provide an intimate glimpse into the workings of Egypt's imperial system at its height. Babylonian kings complained about the quality of gold sent as gifts, while Assyrian rulers begged for Egyptian military support against their enemies. The pharaoh's responses reveal a ruler supremely confident in his power, dispensing favors and threats with equal ease, while foreign ambassadors waited months for audiences. But it was precisely at this moment of supreme triumph that the seeds of destruction were being planted. Amenhotep III's son, who would become Akhenaten, inherited an empire so secure that he could afford to indulge in dangerous experiments. His religious revolution, the abandonment of Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of a single solar deity, the Aten, was more than theological innovation. It was a fundamental assault on the ideological foundations of Egyptian civilization. The worship of Aten was not merely monotheism, it was an attempt to reshape reality itself. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, built in the middle of nowhere as a physical manifestation of his religious vision. The traditional priesthood was stripped of power and wealth, ancient temples were closed, and the names of the old gods were chiseled from monuments throughout the kingdom. The economic disruption was immediate and catastrophic. The powerful priesthood of Amun, which had controlled vast estates and commanded the loyalty of thousands of workers, found itself suddenly dispossessed. Temple workshops that had produced luxury goods for export were shuttered, while the skilled artisans who had decorated tombs and temples for generations found their traditional iconography forbidden. The entire cultural infrastructure of Egyptian civilization was torn apart and rebuilt according to Akhenaten's radical vision. The psychological impact was catastrophic. For 3,000 years, Egyptians had lived in a world where the pharaoh was the son of Ra, where the Nile flooded because of the god's favor, where the cosmic order itself depended on the proper performance of ancient rituals. Akhenaten swept all of this away in favor of an abstract deity who could only be approached through the pharaoh himself. The priests who had maintained the sacred traditions were reduced to irrelevance, while foreign enemies watched with growing confidence as Egypt turned inward, consumed by religious upheaval. The provincial temples that had served as centers of local administration for centuries were abandoned, their priests scattered, and their records destroyed. Local governors found themselves cut off from the religious legitimacy that had underpinned their authority, while the complex system of tribute collection and redistribution that had sustained the empire began to break down. Foreign vassals, no longer bound by oaths to gods they were forbidden to worship, began to question their loyalty to a pharaoh who seemed to have gone mad. The Amarna period lasted barely 17 years, but its effects would echo through the final centuries of the empire. When Akhenaten died, possibly murdered by his own officials, the counter-revolution was swift and merciless. The boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose original name Tutankhaten revealed his connection to the heretic king, was compelled to restore the old gods and abandon the new capital. But the damage was done. The spell of pharaonic invincibility had been broken, and Egypt's enemies had learned that the god-king could be challenged, could make mistakes, could be overthrown. The restoration under Tutankhamun was violent and complete. Akhenaten's city was abandoned so hastily that archaeologists have found meals still sitting on tables, jewelry scattered on floors, and official documents left to blow in the desert wind. The pharaoh's name was chiseled from every monument. His mummy was destroyed, and his memory was cursed for eternity. The priests of Amun returned to power with a vengeance, demanding compensation for their years of exile and humiliation. The reign of Tutankhamun, brief and politically insignificant, has become ironically the most famous in Egyptian history through the accident of his tomb's survival. When Howard Carter peered through that small hole in 1922 and gasped, "Wonderful things," he was looking at the funeral goods of a pharaoh who died at 18, possibly from a blow to the head, his mummy showing signs of hasty mummification and political chaos. The golden splendor of his burial goods masks the reality of a kingdom in crisis, an empire whose foundations were cracking even as its artisans created objects of unparalleled beauty. The hasty nature of Tutankhamun's burial reveals the continuing instability that plagued Egypt even after the restoration. His mummy shows signs of having been mummified quickly and carelessly, suggesting that his death was unexpected and that the officials responsible for his burial were working under severe time pressure. The tomb itself, while filled with treasures, was too small for a pharaoh and may have been originally intended for a private individual. The military pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Seti I and Ramesses II, attempted to restore Egyptian prestige through renewed conquest, but they were fighting against the tide of history. The Bronze Age world was becoming more complex, more militarized, more dangerous. The Hittites had emerged as a rival superpower in Anatolia, their iron weapons and military organization challenging Egyptian supremacy. New peoples were migrating across the Mediterranean, carrying with them technologies and tactics that rendered traditional Egyptian warfare obsolete. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, fought between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli, was less a victory than a desperate struggle for survival. Despite the pharaoh's propaganda claims of triumph, the Egyptian army was nearly destroyed in an ambush, and only Ramesses II's personal courage in rallying his scattered forces prevented complete catastrophe. The battle marked the end of Egyptian expansion and the beginning of a long, slow retreat that would continue for centuries. The Egyptian records of Kadesh, carved on temple walls throughout the kingdom, present a narrative of glorious victory that bears little resemblance to what actually happened. Ramesses II is depicted single-handedly routing the Hittite army, while his own forces rally around him. But Hittite records tell of an Egyptian army that fled the field in panic, and a pharaoh who barely escaped with his life. The propaganda was necessary to maintain morale at home, but it could not disguise the reality that Egypt's military supremacy was ending. Ramesses II, who would rule for 66 years and father over 100 children, embodied both the grandeur and the ultimate futility of Egyptian imperialism. His monuments dwarf even those of his predecessors. Abu Simbel, with its colossal statues carved from living rock, was designed to intimidate Nubian vassal states with its display of pharaonic power. Yet the very size of these monuments betrays a growing desperation, a need to assert dominance through spectacle as actual military power waned. The construction of Abu Simbel required the labor of thousands of workers over decades, resources that might have been better spent on military modernization or economic development. The temple's facade, with its 4 60-foot statues of the pharaoh, was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry. But it was also a monument to vanity and misplaced priorities. Foreign ambassadors were duly impressed by its scale, but they also noted the absence of Egyptian armies from distant battlefields. The peace treaty signed between Egypt and the Hittites in 1259 BC was hailed as a diplomatic triumph, but it was actually a recognition of Egyptian weakness. For the first time, a pharaoh had been forced to negotiate as an equal with a foreign power, acknowledging that Egypt could no longer simply impose its will through superior force. The empire had reached its natural limits, and those limits were now being challenged by new powers, new technologies, and new forms of warfare. The treaty itself, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, reveals the changed balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Hittite version is notably more aggressive in its language, suggesting that they negotiated from a position of strength. Both sides agreed to mutual defense pacts and the extradition of political refugees, but the very need for such agreements acknowledged that neither empire could achieve decisive victory over the other. The decades following the Hittite treaty saw Egypt increasingly isolated as other powers formed alliances against it. The Assyrians were expanding from their homeland in northern Mesopotamia, their iron weapons and professional armies making them formidable opponents. Seafaring peoples from the Aegean were establishing trading posts along the eastern Mediterranean coast, challenging Egyptian control of maritime trade routes. Most ominously, new migrations were beginning in the Balkans and Anatolia, as climate change and population pressure forced entire peoples to seek new homes. It was under Ramesses III that the true nature of the crisis became apparent. Around 1200 BC, a confederacy of sea peoples, mysterious invaders whose origins remain debated, swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a tsunami of destruction. These were not ordinary raiders, but entire peoples on the move, their families and possessions loaded onto ships and ox carts as they fled some unknown catastrophe in their homelands. The sea peoples were unlike any enemy Egypt had faced before. They were not a unified army, but a confederation of displaced populations, each group bringing its own military traditions and technologies. Some fought as heavy infantry with bronze armor and iron weapons, others as archers or slingers, still others as marines who could fight equally well on land or sea. Their diversity made them unpredictable, while their desperation made them incredibly dangerous. Ramesses III's victory inscription boasts of his triumph over these invaders, but the reality was far more complex and costly. The Sea Peoples had already destroyed the Hittite Empire, burned the great cities of the Levant, and reduced the Mycenaean civilization of Greece to ruins. Egypt stood alone against a wave of destruction that was reshaping the entire ancient world. The pharaoh's victory over the Sea Peoples was real, but Pyrrhic. Egypt had survived, but at enormous cost. The empire's foreign territories were lost. The tribute that had funded centuries of monumental building ceased to flow, and the military machine that had made conquest possible was exhausted. The bronze-using civilization of the late Bronze Age was collapsing, and Egypt, despite its survival, was being dragged down with it. The battle itself, fought in the Nile Delta, was less a conventional engagement than a desperate defense of Egypt's heartland. Rameses III deployed his entire available military force, regular troops, provincial militias, foreign mercenaries, and even armed civilians, in a last-ditch effort to prevent the invaders from reaching Memphis. The casualties were horrific on both sides, and the victory came only after the Egyptian fleet managed to destroy the Sea People's ships, trapping their land forces without hope of retreat or resupply. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded over centuries. The 20th dynasty pharaohs who succeeded Rameses III were shadows of their predecessors, their reigns marked by economic crisis, foreign invasion, and internal rebellion. The workers who built the royal tombs went on strike, the first recorded labor action in history, because they hadn't been paid in months. Tomb robbers systematically looted the burial places of earlier pharaohs, melting down golden treasures to buy bread as the economy collapsed. The strikes in the Valley of the Kings were symptomatic of a broader breakdown in Egyptian society. The royal necropolis workers, who had been among the most privileged artisans in the kingdom, found themselves reduced to begging for rations as the government failed to maintain even basic services. Their protests, recorded on papyrus, reveal a population losing faith in the fundamental competence of their rulers. The tomb robberies were equally revealing of Egypt's decline. The sacred burial places of the god kings, which had been inviolate for millennia, were systematically plundered by organized gangs that included temple priests and government officials. The papyrus records of the trials that followed reveal corruption at every level of society, from village headmen who provided inside information to high priests who fenced stolen goods in foreign markets. The third intermediate period that followed the collapse of the New Kingdom was a time of fragmentation and foreign domination that would last for over 4 centuries. First occupied by the Assyrians, then the Persians, and later the Macedonians and Romans, Egyptians would never again reach the glorious heights of self-rule they achieved during previous periods. The unified kingdom that had once terrorized the ancient world dissolved into competing dynasties, each controlling a few cities while foreign powers carved up the former empire among themselves. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt had fragmented once again. The high priests of Amun at Thebes ruled southern Egypt as independent kings, while pharaohs in the north controlled little more than the delta. The empire that had once stretched from Sudan to Syria was reduced to a collection of squabbling city-states, their rulers styling themselves as pharaohs while controlling territories smaller than a modern county. The Libyan dynasties that seized power in the delta represented a new kind of humiliation for Egyptian pride. These were not foreign conquerors in the traditional sense, but descendants of mercenaries who had served in Egyptian armies and gradually accumulated power through intermarriage with Egyptian nobility. Their rise to power was less conquest than gradual infiltration, a process that revealed how thoroughly the traditional Egyptian elite had been weakened. The Nubian conquest of Egypt in the 8th century BC was particularly galling to Egyptian sensibilities. Kings of Nubia ultimately conquered and ruled Egypt for about a century. The former subjects had become the masters, and they ruled from Napata and later Meroe with all the ceremonial trappings of traditional pharaonic kingship. The irony was bitter. Nubian kings were more traditional in their religious practices and more faithful to ancient Egyptian customs than the Egyptians themselves had been for centuries. The Nubian pharaohs, known as the 25th dynasty, attempted to restore Egypt's former glory through a conscious revival of old kingdom traditions. They rebuilt neglected temples, restored ancient rituals, and even constructed pyramids in deliberate imitation of their predecessors. But their efforts came too late to reverse Egypt's decline, and their kingdom faced the same external pressures that had destroyed their predecessors. The final humiliation came with foreign conquest by powers that viewed Egypt not as a rival, but as a prize to be won. Taharqa, pharaoh of the 25th dynasty of Egypt and core of the kingdom of Kush, began agitating peoples within the Neo-Assyrian Empire in an attempt to gain a foothold in the region. But this resistance only hastened the inevitable. The Assyrians swept down from Mesopotamia with their iron weapons and siege engines, reducing Egyptian cities to rubble and carrying off the treasures of millennia. The Assyrian conquest in 671 BC marked the end of Egyptian independence for over a century. The Neo-Assyrian and Egyptian empires were bitter rivals in the first millennium BC. But despite its size and antiquity, Egypt was simply another conquest added to Assyria's empire. The pharaohs were reduced to vassal kings, required to pay tribute and provide troops for Assyrian campaigns against other enemies. The brief site restoration of the 26th dynasty provided a final flicker of Egyptian independence, but it was built on shifting sand. The conquest is attributable to the decline and weakness of the Site dynasty, while concurrently the Persian kings were building an empire that would dwarf all previous ancient Near Eastern powers. When Cambyses II invaded Egypt in 525 BC, the last native pharaoh, Psamtik III, could offer only token resistance before his kingdom was absorbed into the vast Persian Empire. The Persian conquest of Egypt was bloody and difficult, but winning peace in the land of the pharaohs was even more difficult. The Persians found themselves ruling a population that regarded them as barbarian usurpers, and their attempts to legitimize their rule through adoption of pharaonic traditions were met with sullen resistance. Egyptian priests and nobles collaborated when necessary, but never accepted Persian rule as legitimate. The Persian period saw systematic exploitation of Egypt's resources on a scale that dwarfed even the worst excesses of earlier foreign conquerors. The country became a province whose primary function was to fund Persian military campaigns elsewhere, its wealth flowing north to support wars in Greece and Central Asia. The cultural flowering that had characterized earlier periods of Egyptian history came to an end as resources were diverted from temple construction and artistic patronage to military expenditure and administrative costs. Brief periods of independence under native rulers like Amyrtaeus and the pharaohs of the 30th dynasty provided hope that Egypt might yet throw off foreign domination. But these episodes only demonstrated how thoroughly the country had been weakened. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled to Ethiopia in 343 BC as Persian armies occupied Memphis and Alexandria. The age of Egyptian independence was over, and it would never truly return. Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC was welcomed by many Egyptians as liberation from Persian rule, but it marked the beginning of an even longer period of foreign domination. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed Alexander's death was Greek in culture and orientation, ruling Egypt as Hellenistic monarchs rather than traditional pharaohs. Although they adopted some Egyptian customs and built temples in traditional styles, they remained essentially foreign rulers governing a subject population. The Ptolemaic period saw the final transformation of Egypt from an independent civilization into a Hellenistic kingdom. Greek became the language of administration and high culture, while Egyptian gradually retreated to rural areas and religious contexts. The ancient priesthood survived, but was increasingly marginalized, its influence confined to maintaining traditional rituals that fewer and fewer people understood or cared about. Yet even in defeat, Egypt's cultural influence proved more durable than its military power. The cult of the goddess Isis became popular throughout the Roman Empire, while Egyptian obelisks were transported to Rome as symbols of imperial prestige. The conquerors found themselves conquered by the very civilization they had defeated, adopting Egyptian religious practices, artistic styles, and architectural forms. The Roman conquest in 30 BC completed Egypt's transformation from independent empire to imperial province. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, attempted to restore Egyptian independence through alliances with Roman strongmen. But her defeat at Actium ended forever, the dream of Egyptian self-rule. The country became Rome's personal estate, its grain feeding the Roman mob, while its taxes funded Roman legions across 3 continents. Under Roman rule, Egypt became a major center of early Christianity, its desert monasteries producing some of the most influential theologians of the early church. The ancient gods gradually gave way to the Christian god, while hieroglyphic writing was forgotten as Coptic became the written language of native Egyptians. The last temple to maintain traditional Egyptian rituals was closed in the 6th century CE, ending a religious tradition that had endured for over 3 millennia. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE marked the final chapter in the transformation of ancient Egypt. Arabic became the dominant language. Islam replaced Christianity as the majority religion, and Egypt was integrated into the expanding Islamic world. The pyramids remained, but they were no longer symbols of Egyptian power. They were curiosities from a forgotten past, their builders' names lost to all but a handful of scholars. Perhaps most fundamentally, the empire suffered from what modern historians call imperial overstretch, the problem that faces all successful empires when the costs of maintaining their territories exceed the benefits those territories provide. Egypt's empire had grown beyond the point where it could be effectively controlled from the Nile Valley, while the increasing sophistication of its enemies made conquest and occupation progressively more expensive. The ideological foundations of Egyptian imperialism also proved vulnerable to challenge. The concept of divine kingship that had sustained pharaonic authority for millennia was undermined by military defeats, economic crises, and religious upheavals. When foreign kings could defeat pharaohs in battle, when temples stood empty for lack of funds, when traditional rituals were abandoned or forgotten, the entire cosmic order that justified Egyptian rule began to crumble. The pharaohs had built their empire on the belief that they were gods, that their rule was eternal, that Egypt was the center of the universe. But empires, like men, are mortal. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still stand, but the empire that created them has been dust for over 2 millennia. The golden death mask of Tutankhamun, discovered in 1922, stares out at us with eternal eyes, but it cannot speak of the empire's final agony, cannot tell us of the last pharaoh's despair, as foreign armies marched through Memphis while the gods remained silent. Modern archaeological excavations have revealed the extent of Egypt's economic collapse during its final centuries of independence. Settlement patterns shifted dramatically as urban centers were abandoned in favor of fortified sites that could offer protection from raiders and invaders. Trade networks that had connected Egypt to the broader Mediterranean world broke down, leaving communities isolated and impoverished. Even the elaborate burial practices that had characterized Egyptian civilization for millennia were simplified or abandoned as resources became scarce. In the end, the Egyptian empire fell not because it was weak, but because it was human. Its builders dreamed of eternity, but created only another chapter in the endless story of rise and fall that defines human civilization. The empire's monuments remain, but they are no longer symbols of power. They are tombstones, marking the grave of a civilization that once believed it would last forever.